Chapter 22 of Galactic Patrol by E. E. Smith. Chapter 22. But Kinnison was not heading for Helmuth's base, yet. He was splitting the ether toward Aldebaran instead, as fast as his speedster could go, and she was one of the fastest things in the galaxy. He had two good reasons for going there before he attempted Bosconi's grand base. First, to try out his skill upon non-human intellects. If he could handle the wheelmen, he was ready to take the far greater hazard. Second, he owed those wheelmen something, and he did not like to call in the whole patrol to help him pay his debts. He could, he thought, handle that base himself. Knowing exactly where it was, he had no difficulty in finding the volcanic shaft which formed the entrance to the Aldebarian base. Down that shaft his sense of perception sped. He found the lookout plates, and followed their power leads. Gently, carefully, he insinuated his mind into that of the wheelman at the board, discovering, to his great relief, that that monstrosity was no more difficult to handle than had been the Rigelian observer. Mind or intellect, he found, were not affected at all by the shape of the brains concerned. Quality, reach, and power were the essential factors. Therefore, he let himself in and took position in the same room from which he had been driven so violently. Kinnison examined with interest the wall through which he had been blown, noting that it had been repaired so perfectly that he could scarcely find the joints which had been made. These wheelmen, the Lindsman knew, had explosives, since the bullets which had torn their way through his armor and through his flesh had been propelled by that agency. Therefore, to the mind within his grasp, he suggested the place where explosives are kept, and the thought of that mind flashed to the storeroom in question. Similarly, the thought of the one who had access to that room pointed out to the Lindsman the particular wheelman he wanted. It was as easy as that. And since he took care not to look at any of the weird beings, he gave no alarm. Kinnison withdrew his mind delicately, leaving no trace of its occupancy, and went to investigate the arsenal. There he found a few cases of machine rifle cartridges, and that was all. Then he went into the mind of the munitions officer, where he discovered that the heavy bombs were kept in a distant crater, so that no damage would be done by any possible explosion. Not quite as simple as I thought, Kinnison ruminated, but there's a way out of that, too. There was. It took an hour or so of time, and he had to control two wheelmen instead of one, but he found that he could do that. When the munitions master took out a bomb scow after a load of HE, the crew had no idea that it was anything except a routine job. The only wheelman who would have known differently, the one at the lookout board, was the other whom Kinnison had to keep under control. The scow went out, got its load, and came back. Then, while the Lindsman was flying out into space, the scow dropped down the shaft. So quietly was the whole thing done that not a creature in that whole establishment knew that anything was wrong until it was too late to act. And then none of them knew anything at all. Not even the crew of the scow realized that they were dropping too fast. Kinnison didn't know what would happen if a mind, to say nothing of two of them, died while in his mental grasp, and he did not care to find out. Therefore, a fraction of a second before the crash, he jerked free and watched. The explosion and its consequences did not look at all impressive from the Lindsman's point of vantage. The mountain trembled a little, then subsided noticeably. From its summit there erupted an unimportant little flare of flame, some smoke, and an insignificant shower of rock and debris. However, when the scene had cleared up, there was no longer any shaft leading downward from that crater. A floor of solid rock began almost at its lip. Nevertheless, the Lindsman explored thoroughly all the region where the stronghold had been, making sure that the cleanup had been 100% effective. Then, and only then, did he point the speedster's streamlined nose towards star cluster AC 257-4736. In his hidden retreat so far from the galaxy's crowded suns and worlds, Helmuth was in no enviable or easy frame of mind. 4 times he had declared that that accursed Lindsman, whoever he might be, must be destroyed, and had mustered his every available force to that end, only to have his intended prey slip from his grasp, as effortlessly as a droplet of mercury eludes the clutching fingers of a child. That Lindsman, with nothing except a speedster and a bomb, had taken and had studied one of Bosconi's new battleships, thus obtaining for his patrol the secret of cosmic energy. Abandoning his own vessel, then crippled and doomed to capture or destruction, he had stolen one of the ships searching for him, and in it he had calmly sailed to Valentia, right through Helmuth's screen of blockading vessels. He had in some way so fortified Valentia as to capture 6 more Bosconian battleships. In one of those ships he had won his way back to the prime base of the patrol, with information of such immense importance that it had robbed the Bosconian organization of its then overwhelming superiority. More, he had found or had developed new items of equipment which, save for Helmuth's own success in obtaining them, would have given the patrol a definite and decisive superiority over Bosconia. Now both sides were again equal, except for that Lindsman and the Linz. Helmuth still quailed inwardly whenever he thought of what he had undergone at the Arisian barrier, and he had given up all thought of securing the secret of the Linz by force, or from Arisia, but there must be other ways of getting it. And just then there came in the urgent call from Boisia II, followed by the stunningly successful revolt of the hitherto innocuous Blakesley, culminating as it did in the destruction of Helmuth's every Boisian device of vision, or of communication. Blue-white with fury, the Bosconian high chief flung his net abroad to take the renegade, but as he settled back to await results, a thought struck him like a blow from a fist. Blakesley was innocuous. He never had, did not now and never would have, the cold nerve and the sheer dominating power he had just shown. Toward what conclusion did that fact point? The furious anger disappeared from Helmuth's face, as though it had been wiped therefrom with a sponge, and he became again the cold, calculating mechanism of flesh and blood that he ordinarily was. This conception changed matters entirely. This was not an ordinary revolt of an ordinary subordinate. The man had done something which he could not possibly do. So what? The Linz again. Again, that accursed Lindsman, the one who had somehow learned really to use his Linz. "Walmarth, call every vessel at Boisia base," he directed crisply. "Keep on calling them until someone answers. Get whoever is in charge there now, and put him on me here." A few minutes of silence followed. Then Vice Commander Krimsky reported in full everything that had happened, and told of the threatened destruction of the base. "You have an automatic speedster there, have you not?" "Yes, sir." "Turn over command to the next in line, with orders to move to the nearest base, taking with him as much equipment as is possible. Caution him to leave on time, however, for I very strongly suspect that it is now too late to do anything to prevent the destruction of the base. You alone, take the speedster and bring away the personnel files of the men who went with Blakesley. A speedster will meet you at a point to be designated later and relieve you of the records." An hour passed, 2, then 3. "Walmark, Blakesley and the hospital ship have vanished, I presume?" "They have." The underling, expecting a verbal flaying, was greatly surprised at the mildness of his chief's tone and at the studious serenity of his face. "Come to the center." Then, when the lieutenant was seated, "I do not suppose that you as yet realize what, or rather who, it is that is doing this." "Why, Blakesley is doing it, of course." "I thought so too at first. That was what the one who really did it wanted us to think." "It must have been Blakesley. We saw him do it, sir. How could it have been anyone else?" "I do not know. I do know, however, and so should you, that he could not have done it. Blakesley of himself is of no importance whatever." "We'll catch him, sir, and make him talk. He can't get away." "You will find that you will not catch him, and that he can get away. Blakesley alone, of course, could not do so, any more than he could have done the things he apparently did do. No, Walmark, we are not dealing with Blakesley." "Who then, sir?" "Haven't you deduced that yet? The Lindsman, fool! The same Lindsman who's been thumbing his nose at us ever since he took one of our first-class battleships with a speedboat and a firecracker." "But, great blinding rockets, how?" "Again I admit that I do not know, yet. The connection, however, is quite evident. Thought. Blakesley was thinking thoughts utterly beyond him. The lens comes from Eregia. The Eresians are masters of thought, of mental forces and processes incomprehensible to any of us. There are elements which, when fitted together, will give us the complete picture. Still, I don't see how they fit. Neither do I, yet. However, it should be clear to you that we do not want the lensman thinking such thoughts as that into this base. We certainly do not. However, surely he can't trace. Just a moment. The time has come when it is no longer safe to say what the lensman cannot do. Our communicator beams are hard and tight, yes. But any beam can be tapped if enough power be applied to it, and any beam that can be tapped can be traced. I expect him to visit us here, and we will be prepared for his visit. That is the reason for this conference with you. Here is a device which generates a field through which no thought can penetrate. I've had this device for some time, but for obvious reasons have not released it. Here are the diagrams and complete constructional data. Have a few hundred of them made with all possible speed, and see to it that every being on this planet wears one continuously. Impress upon everyone, and I will also, that it is of the utmost importance that absolutely continuous protection be maintained, even while changing batteries. Experts have been working for some time upon the problem of protecting the entire planet with such a screen, and there is some little hope of success in the near future. But individual protection will still be of the utmost importance. We cannot impress it too forcibly upon everyone that every man's life is dependent upon each one maintaining his thought screen in full operations at all times. That is all. When the messenger brought in the personal files of Blakesley and the other deserters, Helmuth and his psychologist went over them with minutely painstaking care. The more they studied them, the clearer it became that the chief's conclusion was the correct one. Someone had, in some way, brought an extraordinary mental pressure to bear. Reason and logic told Helmuth that the lensman's only purpose in attacking the Boisian base was to get a line on Grand Base, that Blakesley's flight and the destruction of the base were merely diversions, to obscure the real purpose of the visit. The lensman had staged that theatrical performance especially to hold him, Helmuth, while his beam was being traced, and that was the only reason why the visicet was not sooner put out of action. And finally, that the lensman had scored another clean hit. He, Helmuth himself, had been caught flat-footed. His face hardened and his jaw set at the thought. But he had not been taken in. He was forewarned, and he would be ready, for he was coldly certain that Grand Base and he himself were the real objectives of the lensman. That lensman knew full well that any number of ordinary bases, ships, and men could be destroyed without damaging materially the Bosconian cause. Steps must be taken to make Grand Base as impregnable to mental forces as it already was to physical ones. Otherwise, it might well be that even Helmuth's own life would presently be at stake, and that life was a thing precious indeed. Therefore, council after council was held. Every contingency that could be thought of was brought up and discussed. Every possible precaution was taken. In short, every resource of Grand Base was devoted to the warding off of any possible mental threat which might be forthcoming. Kinnison approached that star cluster with care. Small though it was, as cosmic groups go, it yet was composed of some hundreds of stars and an unknown number of planets. Any one of those planets might be the one he sought, and to approach it unknowingly might prove disastrous. Therefore, he slowed down to a crawl and crept up, light year by light year, with his ultra-powerful detectors fanning out before him, to the limit of their unimaginable reach. He had more than half expected that he would have to search that cluster, world by world, but in that, at least, he was pleasantly disappointed. One corner of one of his plates began to show a dim glow of detection. A bell tinkled, and Kinnison directed his most powerful master plate into the region indicated. This plate, while a very narrow field, had tremendous resolving power and magnification, and in it he saw that there were 18 small centers of radiation surrounding one vastly larger one. There was no doubt, then, as to the location of Helmuth's base, but there arose the question of approach. The lensman had not considered the possibility of a screen of lookout ships. If they were close enough together so that their electromagnetics had even a 50% overlap, he might as well go back home. What were those outposts, and exactly how closely were they spaced? He observed, advanced, and observed again, computing finally that whatever they were so far apart that there could be no possibility of any electro overlap at all. He could get between them easily enough. He wouldn't even have to baffle his flares. There could not be guards at all, Kinnison concluded, but must simply be outposts, set far outside the solar system of the planet they guarded. Not to ward off one-man speedsters, but to warn Helmuth of the possible approach of a force large enough to threaten the grand base of Bosconia. Closer and closer Kinnison flashed, discovering that the central object was indeed a base, startling in its immensity, and completely and intensively fortified, and that the outposts were huge floating fortresses, practically stationary in space relative to the sun of the solar system they surrounded. The Lensman aimed at the center of the imaginary square, formed by 4 of the outposts, and drove in as close to the planet as he dared. Then, going inert, he set his speedster into an orbit. He did not care particularly about its shape, provided that it was not too narrow an ellipse, and cut off all his power. He was now safe from detection. Leaning back in his seat and closing his eyes, he hurled his sense of perception into and through the massed fortifications of Grand Base. For a long time he did not find a single living creature. He traversed hundreds of miles, perceiving only automatic machinery, bank after towering mile-square bank of accumulators, and remote-controlled projectors and other weapons and apparatus. Finally, however, he came to Helmuth's dome, and in that dome he received another severe shock. The personnel in that dome were to be numbered by the hundreds, but he could not make mental contact with any one of them. He could not touch their minds at all. He was stopped cold. Every member of Helmuth's band was protected by a thought screen, as effective as the Lensman's own. Around and around the planet the speedster circled, while Kinnison struggled with this new and entirely unexpected setback. This looked as though Helmuth knew what was coming. Helmuth was nobody's fool, Kinnison knew. But how could he possibly have suspected that a mental attack was in the book? Perhaps he was just playing safe. If so, the Lensman's chance would come. Men would be careless, batteries weakened, and would have to be changed. But this hope was also vain, as continued watching revealed that each battery was listed, checked, and timed. Nor was any screen released, even for an instant, when its battery was changed, the fresh power source being slipped into service before the weakening one was disconnected. Well, that proves that Helmuth knows, Kinnison cogitated, after watching vainly several such changes. He's a wise old bird. The guy really has jets. I still don't see what I did that could have put him wise to what was going on. Day after day, the Lensman studied every detail of construction, operation, and routine of that base. And finally an idea began to dawn. He shot his attention toward a barracks he had inspected frequently of late, but stopped, irresolute. Kim. Maybe better not, he advised himself. Helmuth's mighty quick on the trigger to figure out that Boysian thing so fast. His projected thought was sheared off without warning, thus settling the question definitely. Helmuth's big apparatus was at work. The whole planet was screened against thought. Oh well, probably better at that, Kinnison went on arguing with himself. If I'd tried it out, maybe he'd have got on to it and laid me a stymie next time, when I really need it. Since he had accomplished everything that he could do for the time being, he went free and hurled his speedster toward Earth, now distant indeed. Several times during that long trip he was sorely tempted to call Haines through his lens and get things started, but he always thought better of it. This was altogether too important a thing to be sent through so much sub-ether, or even to be thought about except inside an absolutely thought-tight room. And besides, every waking hour of even that long trip could be spent very profitably in digesting and correlating the information he had obtained, and in mapping out the salient features of the campaign that was to come. Therefore, before time began to drag, Kinnison landed at Prime Base and was granted instant audience with Port Admiral Haines. Mighty glad to see you, son. Haines greeted the young Lindsman cordially, as he sealed the room thought tight. Since you came in under your own power, I assume that you are here to make a constructive report. Better than that, sir. I'm here to start something in a big way. I know at last where their grand base is, and have detailed plans of it. I think that I know who and where Bosconi is. I know where Helmuth is, and I've worked out a plan whereby, if it works, we can wipe out that base. Bosconi, Helmuth, and all the lesser masterminds at one wipe. Holy jumping rockets! For the first time since Kinnison had known him, the old man lost his poise. He leaped to his feet and seized Kinnison by the arm. I knew you were good, but not that good. The Aresians gave you the treatments you wanted then? They sure did. And the younger man reported as briefly as possible everything that had happened, then outlined the plan upon which he'd been working so long. I'm just as sure that Helmuth is Bosconi as I can be of anything that can't be proved, Kinnison declared, bending over a huge chart and sketching rapidly. Helmuth speaks for Bosconi, and nobody else ever does, not even Bosconi himself. None of the other big shots know anything about Bosconi or ever heard him speak, but they all jump through their hoops when Helmuth, speaking for Bosconi, cracks the whip. And I couldn't get a trace of Helmuth ever taking anything up with any higher-ups. Therefore, I'm dead certain that when we get Helmuth, we get Bosconi. But that's going to be a real job of work. I scouted his headquarters from stem to gudgeon, as I told you, and Grand Base is absolutely impregnable as it stands. I never imagined anything like it. It makes Prime Base here look like a deserted crossroads after a hard winter. They've got screens, pits, projectors, accumulators, all on a gigantic scale. In fact, they've got everything. But you can get all that from the tape. I've learned definitely that we cannot take them by any possible direct frontal attack. Even if we attacked with every ship and mauler we've got throughout the galaxy, they could stand us off. And they match us ship for ship. We'd never get near that base at all if they knew that we were coming. Well, if it's such an impossible job, what? I'm coming to that. It is impossible as it stands, but there's a good chance that I'll be able to soften Grand Base up. You know, like a worm, bore from within. Anyway, that's the only possible way to do it, so I've got to try it. You'll have to put detector nullifiers on every ship assigned to the job, but that'll be easy. I would suggest sending all the maulers and first-class battleships we've got. But you will, of course, work that out later. The important thing, as I gather it, is timing. Absolutely to the minute, since I won't be able to communicate once I get inside their thought screens. How long will it take to concentrate everything we've got and put it in that cluster? 7 weeks, 8 at the outside. +2 for allowances, QX. At exactly hour 20, 10 weeks from today, let every projector of every vessel that you can possibly get there cut loose on that base with everything they can pour in. Where's that other print? Here, 26 main objectives, you see. Blast them all simultaneously to the second. If they all go down, the rest will be possible. If not, it will be just too bad. Then work along these lines here, straight from those 26 stations to the dome, blasting everything as you go. Make it last exactly 15 minutes, not a minute more or less. If, by 15 minutes after 20, the main dome hasn't surrendered by cutting its screens, blast that too if you can. It'll take a lot of blasting, I'm afraid. From then on, you and the fleet commander will have to do whatever is appropriate to the occasion. Your plan doesn't cover that, apparently. Where will you be? How will you be fixed, if the main dome does not cut its screens? I'll be dead, and you'll just be starting the damnedest war that this galaxy ever saw. End of chapter 22.